Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be reading and discussing Part 2, Chapters 6 through 10, of the Dhyana Paul translation of the Śrīmālādevī Siṃhanāda Sūtra. The title of this sutra translates to Discourse on the Lion's Roar of Queen Śrīmālā, and it primarily centers around explaining emptiness, or shunyata, through the lens of Buddha nature discourse. The aspect of a lion's roar in the title alludes to a common metaphor in Buddhist scripture. When somebody says something of great import and wisdom, it's likened to a lion's roar. This text is thought to have been originally composed in the 3rd century CE by members of the Mahasamgika school of Buddhism, which we've talked about previously, and it has become very famous and very important in East Asian Buddhism, with critically important historical figures such as Prince Shotoku in Japan coming to be associated with it either by writing commentaries on it, quoting it in different contexts, or emphasizing its teaching. We hope you enjoy. Chapter 6. The Unlimited Noble Truths. O Lord, the disciples and Pratyekabuddhas first saw the noble truths with their one knowledge that eliminates the latent stages of defilement. With their one knowledge, one of the four wisdoms, they eliminate the source of suffering, namely, the four latent stages of defilements. Know suffering, practice virtue according to the path, and realize extinction. They understand these four noble truths very well. O Lord, they do not have the most supreme transcendental wisdom, but are gradually reaching the four wisdoms and the four conditions, i.e., the four noble truths. The Dharma that is not gradually reached is supreme transcendental wisdom. O Lord, supreme wisdom is like a diamond. O Lord, the disciples and Pratyekabuddhas do not eliminate the stage of beginningless ignorance. Their initial wisdom of the noble truths is not supreme wisdom. Lord, because they do not have the wisdom of the two kinds of noble truths, they eliminate only the latent stages of defilement. O Lord, the Tathagata, Arhat, perfectly enlightened one, is not the realm of all the disciples and Pratyekabuddhas. The inconceivable wisdom of emptiness eliminates the stores of all defilements. O Lord, the ultimate wisdom that destroys the stores of all defilements is called supreme wisdom. The initial wisdom of the noble truths is not ultimate wisdom, but is the wisdom that is turned towards supreme complete enlightenment. O Lord, the meaning of noble does not refer to all the disciples and Pratyekabuddhas. Because the disciples and Pratyekabuddhas have perfected limited merits and have perfected partial merits, they are called noble. The noble truths are not the truths of the disciples and Pratyekabuddhas, nor are they the merits of the disciples and Pratyekabuddhas. O Lord, these truths are those originally known by the Tathagata, Arhat, perfectly enlightened one. Later, on behalf of the world, which is the womb of ignorance, he appears to extensively teach what are known as the noble truths. Chapter 7. The Tathagatagarbha. The noble truths have a most profound meaning, which is extremely subtle, difficult to know, and not of the cognitive and finite realms. What is known by those who have this wisdom is inconceivable to the entire world. Why? Because this profound meaning of the noble truths explains the most profound Tathagatagarbha. The Tathagatagarbha is the realm of the Tathagata, which is not known by all the disciples and Pratyekabuddhas. The Tathagatagarbha explains the meaning of the noble truths. Because the Tathagatagarbha is most profound, explaining the noble truths also is most profound, extremely subtle, difficult to know, and not of the cognitive and finite realms. What is known by those who have this wisdom is inconceivable to the entire world. Chapter 8. The Dharma Body. If there are no doubts with reference to the Tathagatagarbha that is concealed by the innumerable stores of defilement, then there will also be no doubts with reference to the Dharma body that transcends the innumerable stores of defilement. In explaining the Tathagatagarbha, one explains the Dharma body of the Tathagata, the inconceivable Buddha realms, and skillful means. The mind that attains this determination then believes and understands the twofold noble truths. Likewise, what is difficult to know and to understand is the meaning of the twofold Noble Truths. What is their meaning? They are referred to as the conditioned Noble Truths and the unconditioned Noble Truths. The conditioned Noble Truths are the limited Four Noble Truths. Why? Because one who depends on others cannot know all suffering, eliminate all sources of suffering, realize all extinctions of suffering, and practice the entire path. Therefore, O Lord, the cycle of birth and death is both conditioned and unconditioned. Nirvana, likewise, is conditioned and unconditioned. Being nirvana with remainder, conditioned, and nirvana without remainder, unconditioned. The unconditioned Noble Truths are the unlimited Four Noble Truths. Why? With his own power, one who knows the unlimited Noble Truths can know all suffering, sever all sources of suffering, realize all extinctions of suffering, and practice the entire path. These, then, are the 8 Noble Truths. The Tathagatas taught the 4 conditioned Noble Truths as skillful means. The meaning of the 4 unconditioned Noble Truths are the actions of the Tathagatas, Arhats, perfectly enlightened ones, who alone are ultimate. The actions of Arhats and Pratyekabuddhas are not ultimate. Why? Because phenomena are not inferior, mediocre, or superior, one attains nirvana. Why? With reference to the meaning of the 4 unconditioned Noble Truths, the actions of the Tathagatas, Arhats, perfectly enlightened ones, are ultimate. Because all the Tathagatas, Arhats, perfectly enlightened ones, know all future suffering, sever all defilements as well as the sources of all virulent defilements that have been accumulated, and extinguish all the elements in the mind-made bodies of the 3 vehicles, they realize the extinction of all suffering. O Lord, the extinction of suffering is not the destruction of the Dharma. The extinction of suffering signifies the Dharma body of the Tathagata, which is from beginningless time uncreated, non-arising, indestructible, free from destruction, eternal, inherently pure, and separate from all the stores of defilement. O Lord, the Dharma body is not separate from, free from, or different from the inconceivable Buddha Dharmas that are more numerous than the sands of the Ganges River. O Lord, the Dharma body of the Tathagata is called the Tathagatagarbha when it is inseparable from the stores of defilement. Chapter 9. The Underlying Truth, the Meaning of Emptiness. O Lord, the wisdom of the Tathagatagarbha is the Tathagata's wisdom of shunyata, emptiness. O Lord, the Tathagatagarbha has not been seen or attained originally by all the Arhats, Pratyekabuddhas, and powerful Bodhisattvas. O Lord, there are 2 kinds of wisdom of emptiness with reference to the Tathagatagarbha. The Tathagatagarbha that is empty is separate from, free from, and different from the stores of all defilements, and the Tathagatagarbha that is not empty is not separate from, not free from, and not different from the inconceivable Buddha Dharmas that are more numerous than the sands of the Ganges River. O Lord, the various great disciples can believe in the Tathagata with reference to the 2 wisdoms of emptiness. All Arhats and Pratyekabuddhas revolve in the realm of the 4 contrary views because of their knowledge of emptiness. Thus, Arhats and Pratyekabuddhas do not originally see nor attain the wisdom of the Tathagatagarbha. The extinction of all suffering is only realized by the Buddhas who destroy the stores of all defilements and practice the path that extinguishes all suffering. Chapter 10. The One Noble Truth. O Lord, among these 4 noble truths, 3 are impermanent and 1 is permanent. Why? Because 3 of the 4 noble truths are conditioned. What is conditioned is impermanent, and what is impermanent is false and deceptive in nature. What is false and deceptive in nature is not true, is impermanent, and is not a refuge. Therefore, the 3 noble truths, namely, there is suffering, there is the source of suffering, and there is the path, are not the supreme truth, for they are neither permanent nor a refuge. That was part 2, chapters 6 through 10 of the Śrīmālādevī Siṃhanāda Sūtra. Dux, what did you think?
So overall, this one was, I don't know, thinner than the first part. It feels like there is a lot of setup to the cliffhanger that I suspect that you engineered for this at the end of Chapter 10.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have as much to say about it as the last part, for sure. A lot of the overall comments we had about the first part still apply, but for one, these are much shorter chapters, and they're a lot less dense with information. The content we get is retreading a lot of ground in a lot of spots, and there's not as much here, I think, until right at the very end.
I would agree with all of that. Yeah, it's definitely a lot leaner. And, one reason that a lot of scholars think that stuff like that happens when they're thinking about the structure or the form of a sutra text as it's transmitted, you usually want to look at the textual history, and what you often find when you can find stuff about it, when you can find evidence to understand how the text was compiled and constructed and authored, you find that the actual topic that the sutra was given about was, of course, one of the first things to be put down in writing. And then maybe it gets expanded a little bit over time, maybe not. In this case, I don't think it did. And then potentially later on in history, a frame narrative gets put together, or the meat of the sutra gets put into the mouth of somebody other than the Buddha for a particular reason. And for me, I think that the meat of this whole sutra is found in chapters 6 through 10, and it just didn't get expanded to be as long and as dense and as involved as the rest of the sutra. Regardless, though, I think that the real bones, the real contribution, the real unique part of the sutra compared to other ones lies in this section. Like you say, I was building us up to chapter 10. And, in a way, I was also building us up to chapter 7. Chapter 7 is about Tathagatagarbha, or Buddha nature, which we'll talk about in a moment. And as I mentioned at the end of the last episode, the end of part 1, one of my dear friends and colleagues, Turner, who we had on the show very early on for a guest episode to talk about Yogacara Buddhism, he says to this day that the rest of the Tathagatagarbha literature doesn't convince him. He doesn't believe that Buddha nature is possible. He doesn't believe that it makes sense in the cosmology. He's one of the people who, as in Yogacara Buddhism, they believe that it's not universal, that Buddha nature is not something that is a guaranteed future for all sentient beings. But whenever he reads this, and he reads the explanation of Tathagatagarbha in this, then he comes a little bit closer. We'll talk about that and explain more about how this Tathagatagarbha is different from other sutras. But overall, I do think that 6 through 10 includes some of the most important portions of this text doctrinally.
So let's just go through chapter by chapter. So with chapter 6, we have the Unlimited Noble Truths. It seems like you could condense this down to the disciples and the Pratyeka Buddhas are going in the right direction, doing some good, but aren't quite finishing the job because they either do not understand or misunderstand emptiness.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And on that topic, I think that this chapter is a little bit more forgiving than other Mahayana sutras and a little bit more equitable and encouraging, because I want to say first, it's not perfect, right? There's still some sniping going on, but it is saying that at least the Arhats and the Pratyeka Buddhas are moving in the right direction. They're just not going far enough, or they're not doing everything that they could do if they operated on knowledge of emptiness. Other texts we've seen, they don't hold back. They'll say stuff like these Arhats and these Pratyeka Buddhas are idiots and they're failing and they're spinning their wheels.
We've read several and complained about it multiple times already.
Yeah, and so I do feel this one's a little bit more forgiving in that regard and is not so condescending as to say these Arhats and Pratyeka Buddhas are completely out of sorts, right? It's saying they're doing good work and doing important work. It's just that they can't go past the state that they're at because of this reason.
Onward to chapter 7, the Tathagatagarbha. This word is translated usually as Buddha nature, and it's a seed for enlightenment. And the disciples and the Pratyeka Buddhas haven't found it yet, and it's inconceivable for those without it. So that is a foundational reason why they misunderstand emptiness in Chapter 6, and why this kind of thing is impossible to transmit with just words. So there's where we get to the odd ways that this type of Mahayana will explain or teach things. The lesson is, quote, not of the cognitive and finite realms. So there's no straightforward way to explain it. And I'll also say that this is a 1-paragraph long chapter. So is this the spot that convinced Turner? Because I don't understand it.
Yes and no, yeah. So the Tathagatagarbha doctrine first comes up in this chapter, but we'll keep coming back to it when we get through 11 through 15. But yeah, so let's discuss kind of what's going on here, right? So we have read the Tathagatagarbha Sutra, and we've read sutras from the genre of Tathagatagarbha literature. So there is one singular text that is called the Tathagatagarbha Sutra, and then there's a genre of texts that all discuss the topic. And there's some important distinctions to make whenever we're talking about this. So the literal translation of the word is, of course, Tathagata, meaning Buddha, the thus come one, and Garbha, which means matrix or seed or womb. And so there's cosmologically a couple of different ways to interpret what this means. The Tathagatagarbha literature that we've read and discussed so far argues that all sentient beings, or most sentient beings, have this Tathagatagarbha. If you define it as a seed or a womb, then that means that it is the potentiality for future Buddhahood, achievement of future Buddhahood. Not just achievement of future enlightenment. It's the achievement of future Buddhahood, the potentiality for it. And if you define it as a matrix or as a womb, then it's interpreted that that's more of a guarantee. So it's no longer a potentiality, it's more of a guarantee. This is where Yogacara Buddhism really has like a fork in the road with Chan Buddhism, and then later on in history as it travels to Japan, Zen Buddhism, and other kinds of Mahayana Buddhism. This fork in the road really is over this potentiality versus guarantee of Buddhahood. And the reason why there's such a sort of split over this has to do with the fact that it's not going to square with the cosmology as it's been taught up to this point in history if we say that all sentient beings are guaranteed to achieve Buddhahood at some point in the future. The guarantee is the problem. And the reason why it breaks apart is a bit circular. People will respond to this text and they'll say, the guarantee of Buddhahood in the future is impossible because I don't believe it to be possible. And if I don't believe it to be possible, then that means that by definition it can't be possible because, this is a matter of doctrine. This is a matter of coming to know the nature of reality and the universe and stuff. So it's a matter of like, I can choose for this not to be the case. And I do because it doesn't square with previous stuff. Okay, and then this text, it solves that problem in an interesting way. But in solving it, it does create that fork, that split. So the way that this text, in my interpretation, solves that problem is it says that all beings do have that potentiality, but in order to make the jump from potentiality to guarantee, you must accept its existence, and you must realize its existence, and you must come to understand its relationship with emptiness, right? And that's what the next couple of chapters are going to be discussing is emptiness. And when we get to the big cliffhanger in chapter 10, we're going to be explaining that in terms of emptiness as well. So this is going to be like the first stake in a path of kind of understanding the relationship between Buddha nature as a nature that possesses of all sentient beings and emptiness as, a fundamental core principle in samsara.
So next we have chapter 8, the Dharma body. So this chapter primarily seems to be reinforcing the previous two, and it talks about how there are actually 8 noble truths, the conditioned 4 that we've discussed already and have been discussing for a while, and then there is an unconditioned 4 noble truths that can't be explained in language and therefore not directly named or even indirectly talked about here. The whole thing is unconditioned and therefore not something that can be transferred in something as conditioned as words. We also see a note again that dependence on others is listed as a major disqualifier. quote, because one who depends on others cannot know all suffering, eliminating all sources of suffering, etc.
We talked about the lack of dependence on others and the kind of individualism in the sutra pointed towards what we've seen in other texts like the Lankavatara Sutra as this thing, quote, self-realization of noble wisdom, which is you're not taught or told about it. You don't have an internal dialogue about it. You're not attaching categories and labels and like tags to that file in your brain. And so that's why it is kind of discussed in the previous chapter as not being of the cognitive and finite realms, because it's not something that can be talked about. It's not something that can be understood through language or communicated through language. It's something that only becomes clear to you if you meditate, practice, and reach that level of spiritual advancement that's necessary for it to arise of its own accord in yourself. So that further kind of contributes to how Tathagatagarbha is thought of differently in this text compared to other ones, because realizing the truth of it and making the jump from potentiality to guarantee is not a matter of interpreting the original doctrine itself, as it seems to be with other texts. Rather, it is a matter of practice. You're able to make that jump as the practitioner from potentiality for Buddhahood to guarantee of Buddhahood through self-realization of this thing, right? And so it solves a lot of problems that the language of the Tathagatagarbha Sutra creates. Language is inherently dualistic and subject to interpretation, and interpretation is subject to mental behaviors and the karma and the level of advancement and intellect that someone's approaching it with. And so it just is not a perfect way for that doctrine to kind of be developed. But this text is skirting around that by saying you'll understand it if you practice it, and you will realize this kind of wordless truth, this supracognitive truth. And if you do that, then you're set. You're good to go.
So I had a few lines that I wanted to poke at in specific here. So, quote, therefore, O Lord, the cycle of birth and death is both conditioned and unconditioned. Nirvana likewise is conditioned and unconditioned, being nirvana with remainder, conditioned, and nirvana without remainder, unconditioned. End quote. I'm especially interested in what she means when she's talking about nirvana being conditioned and unconditioned here. Is the nirvana achieved by those who don't quite complete the path, the arhats, the pratyeka buddhas? Is that the conditioned nirvana, whereas the nirvana you get from becoming a fully realized Buddha is the unconditioned?
That's a good question, and this is a good quote to kind of dig into. So I don't know if we've talked about it very much recently, but I feel like on the show at some point we've talked about how as Mahayana develops, they start to have these discussions about different levels of nirvana, different levels of Buddhahood, and some of them are better than others. In this case, we're kind of seeing a representation of that doctrine in the context of this Tathagatagarbha and emptiness doctrine that we're being kind of challenged to relate here in this text. So the cycle of birth and death is conditioned and not conditioned. And conditioned here is going to mean that it slots nicely into a network of causality. It is caused by something and it causes something. Unconditioned is whenever it is not in that sense of causality. The reason why this seems a little weird and confusing is because previously it was kind of understood in a more simplistic fashion. Samsara is conditioned, nirvana is unconditioned, right? But then they realized like nirvana happens as a result of people doing stuff. It's a result of a cause. And the state in which you're in is not a causal state when you're in nirvana. When you're in nirvana, you're not acting in ways that cause results. Unless you choose to, if you're a Buddha and you come back to teach and cause other people to attain nirvana, the state itself is, free from causation. It is the result of an action done by a person, and it's also a place where you can make results. So that kind of explains how it's conditioned and unconditioned. Also, we have this kind of non-dualistic perspective of looking at samsara as well. Samsara is part of the Dharma realm, and the Dharma realm is unconditioned. So its existence, its continued existence, its perpetual existence is unconditioned because it's not caused by an anthropomorphized God who chooses that to be the case. It's not caused by a creation story or anything like that. Its continued existence is not dependent upon any other cause or condition because it's part of this Dharma realm. Looking at nirvana with remainder is whenever you've attained nirvana, but you can still act in samsara, right? You're still there in some small way. That's fully conditioned. And the reason that it's fully conditioned is because you haven't exited causality. And then nirvana without remainder is fully unconditioned. You're not acting in the world anymore. You're not acting in samsara, causing people to attain enlightenment themselves. You're fully out of that cycle of birth and death. So you are in the full, complete state of unconditioned. All that really does is take a binary that we had early on in Buddhist history, samsara, conditioned, nirvana, unconditioned, and it creates a spectrum out of that. A spectrum of here's something that's totally unconditioned, here's something that's totally conditioned, and here's everything in between.
So, I want to talk a little bit about word choice before we leave this chapter. So one thing I'll note is that the word arhats seems to be overloaded. There is a capital A version used when referring to Buddhas, while there's a lowercase a version used to refer to followers. What we would say Theravada followers, or folks who have obtained some level of enlightenment but did so depending on the Buddha for that, so therefore it's not complete. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And the reason why we see arhat with a capital A attached to a title of the Buddha, or to Buddhas in general, is that these are kind of like progressive and cumulative stages. And so every Buddha has to go through the arhat stage first before reaching full Buddhahood, and has to go through the bodhisattva stage first as well before total and complete Buddhahood. And so they can be called arhats, bodhisattvas, and Buddhas all at the same time because they've done all that stuff.
Makes sense. Just wanted to make sure. I'll also note that I noticed the word eternal describing something here, which gets my defenses up because impermanence is a thing and it's very important. But in this context, it is referring to the Dharma body, which is therefore referring to the Dharma, which is outside of samsara, outside of causality, and therefore allowed to be permanent or eternal.
That's right, yeah. I was talking about like conditioned and unconditioned before, and all that is unconditioned is by definition also eternal, because conditions come and go. Conditions are impermanent. And so whenever something is unconditioned, it's no longer subject to impermanence. And that's why we can say the Dharma itself is not subject to impermanence.
All right. So chapter 9, the underlying truth, the meaning of emptiness. This chapter really frustrates me because that title sets an expectation of answering some really important questions, and then the content kind of doesn't do much. It seems like the ultimate point of this chapter is that emptiness is the separating condition between the incomplete work of the Arhats and Pratyekabuddhas. It doesn't directly, at least, say anything about what emptiness actually means, though. It's already been set up as inconceivable, so there's a limit to how much it can be explained here, but this is still frustrating. The actual meaning of emptiness isn't talked about here. It's more that it's used as a boundary line. This chapter is more talking about its effects rather than its meanings, it feels like.
Yeah, I totally get that. And that's because the title of it is translated as like the meaning of the underlying principle of emptiness, right? Or to be more specific in our translation, the underlying truth, the meaning of emptiness. So we would think we're going to get a good explanation of what emptiness actually is being described as here. To answer that question, the emptiness that's being talked about here is the Huayan or Kegon version of emptiness that we've encountered before, which can be likened to the metaphor of Indra's net. So through the nature of all things as arising in the universe, in reality, related to each other by causes and conditions, related to each other by these unseen connections in this grand, vast network, we can infer a shared nature among all of them. Part of the reason why we can infer that is because of their shared nature as being impermanent. And then the other part is, like I say, they are all connected causally through a varying number of degrees. If we think about it in a concrete example, right? If there's like a cup in front of you, that cup creates a causal link between you and the parent of the person who worked in the factory to make that cup. It causally links you to everybody else in the world who's ever used that particular cup. It causally links you to all the liquids and all the sources of the liquids that have gone in and out of that cup. It causally links you to whatever you've excreted after drinking out of that cup, where all that goes, right? This is building out the network of causality from just that cup. And because all those things are impermanent, because the state of the cup that it's in right now is ever changing, because the state of whatever person made the cup is ever changing, because of the state of what goes in and out of the cup is ever changing, we can infer this kind of Indra's net, this great interconnectedness, this great interdependent origination. And the foundation of all that is emptiness. And so that's what's being signaled to. When they say the meaning of it, we can probably more accurately describe that or translate that as the significance of it. So it's not going to be like, here's an explanation of what we interpret emptiness to be. We kind of just have to know historically. And what we know historically is that it's going to be that Indra's net version of emptiness. It's going to be the significance or the meaning of it in terms of like what it does or doesn't do for people who do or don't believe it. And so Arhats and Pratyekabuddhas, like we say, they spin their wheels. They don't get all the way to the finish line because they don't understand. They get stuck at impermanence, or they get stuck at dependent origination, but they can't put them both together. And they can't examine things in terms of their suchness, with their suchness being that shared nature of all things. They can't make inferences if they examine the cup in front of them about the nature of all the things that are causally related to that cup. And from those inferences, they can't then, after zooming out, zoom back in and see like, oh, the foundation of all reality is at the same time suchness, emptiness, interdependent origination, and Buddha nature. They can't see that the fundament or the foundation of all of reality is the Dharma body, the Dharmakaya, or the realm of the Dharma. They can't understand that the way that things are, if you get way, way, way down to the source code of it all, the source code of the program that wrote the source code, if you can say something like that, is the Dharma, is Buddhahood.
Switching the word meaning for significance would have much more accurately represented what is going on in this text. I would not be nearly as frustrated if I was reading about the significance of emptiness, because this is a chapter about the significance of emptiness. So we could call that a mistranslation, a poor localization choice, whatever. There's a lot of ways to put that through, but that reframing does make the chapter make more sense to me.
Definitely, yeah.
So finally we get to this part's big exclamation point. What is this talking about, addition to the doctrine? Chapter 10, the One Noble Truth. The final way to break this down is that of the Four Noble Truths, only one is unconditioned. Only one is eternal. The others are false and deceptive in nature. So the false ones are, there is dukkha, the source of dukkha is desire, and then the final noble truth, the path to end dukkha. This means that the third noble truth, the extinction of dukkha, is the only true, permanent, actually noble truth. So this begs the question, if dukkha itself is impermanent, how is the extinction of dukkha permanent? Semantically, that does not jive at all. So I suspect there will be further explanation in the rest of the sutra, but that's quite a claim. That's a big swing to take.
Yeah, this is a big one. And I love this chapter because, like you say, in one paragraph, it just blows apart so much of what we think we know from previous stuff we've read, right? This is a very controversial and a very impactful and incisive claim. And from a relatively unknown sutra, at least in terms of what people in the West know. We know about the first sutra, we know about the Heart Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, etc., etc. This one is relatively unknown, right? But in this case, the argument here is out of the Four Noble Truths, 3 of them are conditioned and thus false and deceptive. The third out of 4 is the unconditioned one, is the eternal one, and thus is the only true permanent noble truth. To answer your question, if dukkha itself is impermanent, how is the extinction of dukkha permanent? It is speaking to how in the doctrine of Tathagatagarbha, in the doctrine of Buddha nature, there's only one way out. There's only one exit. And that's a one-way exit. So you're in the state of dukkha. You're in the state of conditionality. There's only ever 2 potential places to go from there. One place is to continue in dukkha and conditionality, and the other is to exit dukkha and unconditionality. Once you exit dukkha and exit conditionality, and you're in this state of the unconditioned, there is no going back. Once dukkha is extinguished, it's gone. And the reason why is because Buddha nature doesn't work backwards. It only works forwards. Buddha nature doesn't work in a scheme where you achieve Buddhahood and then you can go back and go from being a Buddha back to being a regular person. You can't ever go from being a Buddha back to being a normal person. You can only ever go from being a normal person to being a Buddha.
I guess my objection to that is, sure, for you, but dukkha still exists for other beings at that point. It seems like at some point there is a assumption of a very subjective, focus to one perspective view of the Noble Truths that I was not informed of ahead of time and don't follow here. But also, there's more chapters to read, so I will give this a chance to further explain itself, but it seems like it's using a semantic trick almost to alter the frame on previous thought, and I don't know, it seems almost like cheating from that, or maybe not cheating, but it feels like this is something that you would say to have the most mind-blowing take, rather than as a matter of a full conclusion, thought-out argument. Like, I don't know, that explanation does not do it for me. There's a trick there that I feel like I'm not sure how I feel on it, and that's because we haven't finished reading it.
I totally get that. So the explanation I gave was in a context of a little bit more of an individualistic description of achievement of Buddhahood, but there are ways to interpret and explain it on a much larger scale than just that, right? So another way to look at it is something that Buddhists have been concerned about in the context of talking about conditioned and unconditioned. Their question is like, what's the bridge? What's the bridge between the state of conditionality and the state of unconditionality? Like, we know that the goal and the destination is Dharma and unconditionality, but we're currently in this state of conditionedness. What do we do? How do we get out of it? And this is kind of speaking to that a little bit. What it's saying is essentially the noble truth of dukkha, the noble truth of the source of dukkha as desire, and the noble truth of the path to ending dukkha. These are things that are potentially subject to change. These are things that are potentially able to be described or interpreted in different ways. Different Buddhas across history, across the different eons, have taught differently in different contexts. The Four Noble Truths have been given to us by our historical Buddha, but theoretically in the Buddhist cosmology, there's been other communication, different ways to describe the Four Noble Truths. For example, we've talked a lot about how some Pure Lands don't have a word for suffering. They don't have a word for dukkha. So how do they teach the Four Noble Truths? That's kind of an open question that would need some answering. In another way of kind of describing and interpreting this, what it's saying is that, the only unconditioned action of the Dharma realm that ever takes place is the extinction of dukkha in sentient beings. It doesn't happen to everybody. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's like the only action, the only behavior, the only move that can be made. When I say move, I kind of think of it in terms of like an organism level move. In biology, for example, an evolutionary move or like a organismal move is kind of like a species scale or like a population scale moved to deal with a change in resources or what have you, right? This is kind of like the the global or the universal or the reality level move that takes place, or doesn't. It's kind of signaling that's the only two options, either the extinction of dukkha or not.
I'm not sure what kind of reply to give to that. Again, it seems like this is framing a semantic argument as a huge bombshell delivery, and I am currently unconvinced. But, like I said before, I will read the rest and give it a chance to convince me.
Yeah, chapter 11 and 12. Chapter 11 is the one refuge, and it's just like 5 sentences about this noble truth of the extinction of suffering. And then chapter 12 explains the ways in which the other 3 noble truths are contrary or false or deceptive. And so there's going to be a lot more chance to unpack this as we continue on into part 3.
Anything else to add to part 2 before we close it?
I think I'm good.
All right. Well, in that case, let's close down part 2, and we'll pick this back up in part 3. We'll see what happens then.
Thank you for listening to part 2 of our reading and discussion of the Śrīmālādevī Siṃhanāda Sūtra. Join us next time for part 3, where we'll continue building on some of the meat and potatoes of the sutra that we've been discussing so far.
Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Hi, Nick here, and you've been listening to Bright on Buddhism. Normally at this point in the episode, we would throw to a charity that we think that is deserving of your money or your support. Because there's so much going on right now, we have decided that we're going to open it up to any charity that you think is a good cause to share your resources with. So, if you like our show and would like to support us, please instead give to a charity that you believe does good things for people in need. Thank you.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.